The law had been written into the stars long before she was born. On every world bound by the Galactic Compact, it was clear a widow of noble blood had 3 standard days to remarry, or she would forfeit her title, her estate, and her freedom. For Lyanna of Veles Prime, those 3 days had begun to bleed away the moment her husband's heart stopped beating in the medical wing. The ceremony of mourning was still underway when the first envoys arrived, hands full of contracts and alliances masked as condolences. Lyanna had expected the vultures. She had not expected how deeply alone she would feel among her own kind. Even now, in the silver-washed corridors of Starport, she moved like a ghost, unseen and unwanted except for the value pinned to her name. Grief gnawed at her in sharp, relentless bites. She had loved Jareth, not with the fever of youth, but with the steady loyalty of one who chooses, and chooses again each day. His death had torn something essential from her, yet she was not permitted the luxury of crumbling. Duty pressed harder than sorrow. If she faltered, everything they had built together would be swallowed by political enemies who waited with bared teeth. She leaned against a cool metal pillar, pulling the deep hood of her travel cloak tighter over her pale hair. Her violet eyes, so rare among her people, flicked between the throngs bustling through the port. No familiar faces, no friends, only strangers, and among them, the most alien of all, humans. They were new to the Compact, a young, brash species still learning the tangled etiquette of the stars. To many, humans were a curiosity. To Lyanna, they represented hope. Humans had no blood ties to Veles Prime, no ancestral grudges or hidden agendas. One of them might be desperate or foolish enough to agree. Desperation was a bitter companion, but it sharpened her resolve. She needed someone who had no idea what her name meant, someone who would marry her not for power, but because she asked. She spotted him near a cargo shuttle. Tall, rough-edged, the cut of his clothing suggesting a spacer's life. His hair was an unruly dark mass, and his stance, casual but alert, marked him as someone used to watching his back. Perfect. She straightened, heart hammering against her ribs. It was madness. It was survival. She crossed the docking bay swiftly, weaving through droids and merchants, her boots silent against the deck. As she approached, he turned, sensing her presence, and their eyes locked. His were a deep green, suspicious but not unkind. Before fear could unseat her courage, she spoke. "Marry me," Lyanna said, voice low but unwavering. The man blinked, mouth parting as if unsure he had heard correctly. Around them, the noise of the bay faded into an expectant hush in her ears. He looked her over, noting the fine fabric beneath her cloak, the faint shimmer of royalty she could not completely conceal. He frowned. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked. "No joke," she said quickly. "I am Lyanna of Veles Prime. I require immediate legal union to preserve my status. I will compensate you generously." He took a step back, folding his arms. "Right. And what's the catch? Some warlord's gonna hunt me down?" Lyanna's lips twitched in a smile too tight to be reassuring. "No warlords. Only bureaucracy and a great deal of tedious paperwork." He didn't laugh. Instead, he watched her with a wary intelligence she admired even as it complicated matters. "I'm not in the habit of marrying strangers," he said. "And I am not in the habit of begging," Lyanna countered. "Yet here we are." He scrubbed a hand through his hair, muttering something under his breath. "Name's Elias Rourke," he said finally. "Freelance hauler. I don't do politics." "This is not politics," Lyanna lied smoothly. "It is survival." Elias studied her a long moment more. Behind him, the cargo shuttle's engines rumbled, and the port's announcement system blared another boarding call. Time was slipping away, fast and merciless. 3 days, she said softly. "That's all the law gives me. If I fail to marry by then, I lose everything. And if I say no?" Lyanna hesitated. "Then I will find someone else," she said, though the wave had pressed heavy against her tongue. "Or I will fall." Something flickered across Elias's face, an emotion too quick to name. Pity? Responsibility? Some internal compass she cannot see? "I need to think," he said. "You got somewhere you can wait?" She inclined her head toward a quiet alcove framed by starship schematics. He nodded once gruffly and turned to gather a small bag from the base of the shuttle ramp. Lyanna watched him go, the hard line of his shoulders betraying his unease. She moved to the alcove and sat, fingers laced tightly in her lap. Every muscle in her body trembled with exhaustion and dread, but she forced herself to sit still, to breathe. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance. Across the bay, Elias spoke briefly with Companion, another human, older, with grizzled hair and a limp. They exchanged terse words she couldn't hear. Then Elias was moving back toward her, alone, his jaw set in a grim line. As he neared, Lyanna rose to meet him. She could not read his expression. Everything about this moment felt perilously balanced on a knife's edge. "All right," Elias said, voice low and rough. "I'll hear you out. But if this goes sideways, I'm walking." Relief and fear clashed inside her chest. She nodded once, sharply. "Fair." The agreement hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Somewhere deep in the starport, a new ship launched, casting a ripple of vibration through the floor. It was a sound of journey's beginning or ending. Lyanna squared her shoulders and gestured for Elias to follow. They would find a place to talk, to bargain, to build whatever fragile bridge they needed to survive the next 3 days. Behind her, Elias hesitated, then fell into step at her side. 3 days, and they were already counting. Elias followed Lyanna through the starport's labyrinthine corridors, the faint scent of ozone and fuel thick in the air. His instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let the stranger deal with her impossible problems without dragging him into the center of a political hurricane. Yet something about her, the desperate grace, the rigid control in her posture, hooked under his skin and refused to let go. They ducked into a quiet waiting lounge, its light dim and its seats cracked from years of neglect. Here, the buzz of the port faded into a low murmur beyond thick walls. Lyanna moved like someone accustomed to command, yet cautious now, as if every step she took was weighed and measured. Elias dropped into a chair across from her, leaning forward, arms resting on his knees. "Start talking," he said. She studied him for a moment before speaking, as if gauging how much truth he could bear. "My husband, Lord Jareth of House Velis, died 2 days ago. According to the compact inheritance laws, a widow must remarry within 3 standard days or forfeit all claims to property, titles, and protections." "Yeah, I caught that part," Elias said dryly. "Why not marry someone from your own world?" "Because every eligible suitor from Velis Prime has an interest in seeing me controlled or erased," she said, voice tight with suppressed anger. "They would not marry me. They would cage me." Elias rubbed the back of his neck. This was worse than he thought. Not just politics. High-stakes politics. The kind that ended with bodies floating in forgotten airlocks. "And you figure a human would be neutral." "I figured a human would be free," she said simply, "and perhaps honorable enough to stand by the agreement." He snorted. "You don't know humans very well." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Desperation makes optimists of us all." Elias leaned back, hands laced behind his head, regarding her with narrowed eyes. He didn't know her anything. He didn't even know her. Yet the weight she carried was palpable, a burden too large for her slender frame. She wasn't lying. He would bet his ship on it. She believed every word. "Suppose I say yes," he said. "What happens then?" "We register a union contract with the nearest Galactic Authority outpost," Lyanna said. "It is a legal document, binding under compact law. Afterward, you may live as you choose. You would not be obligated to remain with me." Elias frowned. "You're asking for a marriage on paper." "Exactly. And if I walk away afterward?" "You walk away," she said, voice steady. "You keep whatever compensation we agree upon. I survive." He didn't like it. It smelled wrong, too easy, like bait laid carefully across a snare. Yet she looked at him without pleading, without pretense. Just a brutal, naked honesty that scraped against his instincts. He ran a hand through his hair, blowing out a breath. "You're offering money?" "Credits. Access to my late husband's trading networks. Safe docking privileges on Velis Prime." It was a small fortune for a hauler like him. Enough to repair his battered ship enough to buy independence from the petty deals that kept him barely afloat. Still, the risks coiled in his gut like smoke. Marrying into alien nobility, even temporarily, could tie him to wars he didn't understand, to enemies who didn't care that he was just a hired spacer. "You got enemies?" he asked. Liona's smile was thin. "Fewer than I had yesterday." The cold pragmatism in her words unsettled him more than if she had wept. She was not some fragile court flower. She was surviving by inches, and it hardened her like diamond under pressure. Elias shook his head slowly. "You sure you want me for this? I'm not the polished type. No pedigree. No patience for politics. I want someone who does not already belong to this world," she said. "Someone who has no interest in manipulating me further. You don't even know if I'm trustworthy." "No," Lion agreed, "but I know that you pause to consider when most would have run." That cut deeper than he expected. He shrugged, feigning indifference, but the knot in his chest tightened. "I'll need terms," he said. "Written down. No surprises." "Agreed." A low chime sounded from the port's intercom system, signaling the local dusk cycle. Time slipped through their fingers faster now, each moment pushing her closer to an irreversible fall. Elias stood, dragging a hand over his jaw. "All right, where's the nearest authority post?" "Sector C, Administrative Wing." He jerked his head toward the corridor. "Then let's get moving, before I talk myself out of this." They moved together through the echoing halls, neither speaking. Around them, the port settled into the uneasy rhythms of night, merchants securing their stalls, ships gliding into dock under fields of electric light. Elias glanced at Lina as they walked, at the ridges at her shoulders, the tight clench of her hands hidden in her sleeves. She wore her fear like armor, invisible yet undeniable. Part of him wanted to ask why her world was so cruel. Part of him wanted to demand why she hadn't found someone safer, someone who could guarantee her protection. Most of him knew the answer already. Sometimes, survival was a matter of choosing the least terrible option. They reached the admin wing, a spire of steel and crystal rising above the rest of the port. Lights gleamed along its surface, indifferent and cold. Lina hesitated at the threshold, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her composure. Elias brushed his knuckles lightly against her arm, surprising them both. "You ready?" he asked. She lifted her chin, violet eyes steady. "Yes." Together, they stepped inside. Neither saw the shadowed figure watching from across the concourse, nor the silent message sent rippling through the station's hidden channels. She has chosen a human. Move to intercept. The first move had been made. The next would come far faster and far bloodier than either of them could imagine. The Galactic Authority outpost was a cavernous chamber of glass and gunmetal. Its ceiling lost the glow of suspended holographic displays. Officials moved with mechanical precision, their uniforms crisp, their expressions bland. For a place where fates were decided and alliances forged, it felt remarkably sterile, as though humanity and consequence had been sanitized away. Elias kept pace beside Lina, their steps echoing over the polished floor. A registrar, a tall woman with augmented silver eyes, glanced up from her terminal as they approached. "State your business," she intoned without looking away from her screen. Lina spoke first, her voice steady. "We seek to register a legal union under Compact Code 12 Alpha." The registrar's hands paused over a console, fingers twitching slightly. Her silver gaze flicked between them, assessing, recording. Elias resisted the urge to squirm under the weight of that mechanical stare. "Proceed to booth 7, the woman said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Identification, terms of agreement, and biometric confirmation will be required." They moved toward the indicated booth, a small alcove enclosed by translucent barriers. Inside, the air felt thick, as if the very walls anticipated conflict. A console screen blinked, awaiting their input. Elias scanned the terms Lina projected from her wrist device. They were shockingly simple. Marriage of legal convenience. No claims on property beyond agreed compensation. Dissolution permitted after one standard year or at mutual consent. No traps. No hidden clauses. Just survival laid bare. "You're really trusting me with this?" he muttered. "I am trusting necessity." Lionel replied. He pressed his palm to the console first. A slight sting as the biometric scan completed. Then Lionel followed, her hand smaller but unwavering. The system hummed as it processed a union. Streams of coded light dancing across the screen. Contract binding. The terminal announced in a monotone. It was done. For a moment, neither of them moved. The enormity of it settled over Elias like an invisible weight. In less than an hour, he had tied his fate to a woman he had met only that day, on a world he barely understood, under a law he hadn't even known existed until now. Lionel's shoulders eased minutely. The first crack in her relentless control. She turned to him with something almost resembling gratitude, a fragile thing that flickered and vanished before he could grasp it. "Thank you," she said simply. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the sincerity in her voice. "Don't thank me yet. You still might regret this." "Regret is a luxury I cannot afford." Before he could reply, a low tremor rippled through the floor, subtle but unmistakable. Elias stiffened, instincts honed from years in rough space flaring to life. He caught the way Lionel's eyes sharpened, the way her body shifted subtly into a defensive posture. Something was wrong. The registrar's voice crackled over the intercom. "All parties remain where you are. Security sweep in progress." Elias swore under his breath. Security sweep usually meant a credible threat, or a manufactured excuse for one. He reached instinctively for the weapon at his belt, only to remember he had left it secured on his ship. Beside him, Lionel's hand drifted to the folds of her cloak, her fingers brushing something hidden beneath. "We need to move," she murmured. "Now?" Elias asked, incredulous. "Won't running just make us bigger targets? Staying makes us dead ones." There was no time to argue. Already, shadows moved at the edges of the chamber, figures too heavily armored to be standard port security. Elias grabbed Lionel's arm, steering her toward a side passage barely visible behind a line of dormant terminals. They slipped into the maintenance corridor, the door sliding shut behind them with a hiss. The hall was narrow, lined with pipes and flickering lights. It reeked of ozone and machinery, but at least it offered cover. "Who are they?" Elias whispered as they hurried down the passage. "House Orlanth, most likely," Lionel said grimly. "They've wanted Velis Prime's holding for generations. My marriage to an outsider threatens their claim, and they're willing to kill over it. It would not be their first murder." Elias grimaced. He had stepped into a game far bloodier than he had anticipated. Still, he tightened his grip on her hand, leading her through the maze of corridors with the ease of someone who had spent too many years finding back doors and shortcuts in places he didn't belong. Alarms began to wail in the distance, sharp, pulsing notes that made the walls vibrate. Somewhere behind them, the heavy stomp of armored boots grew louder. "Shortcut?" Lionel asked, glancing at him. "Working on it." He scanned the corridor markings, searching for the maintenance docks. If they could reach the sublevels, they might find a way out without being funneled into a trap. Finally, he spotted a faded schematic painted on the wall. "There," he said, jabbing a finger toward a maintenance hatch. They pried it open and dropped into the darkness below. The air grew colder, damper. Pipes snaked overhead like the twisted roots of some mechanical forest. Elias pulled a small light from his jacket, its beam slicing a narrow path through the gloom. Lionel moved with surprising agility, her cloak snapping around her like a living thing. She kept close, her breathing shallow but controlled. "You've done this before," Elias noted. "I had to learn," she said. "Royal courts are not safe places." "No kidding." They wove through the underbelly of the station, the sounds of pursuit fading slightly. But Elias knew it wouldn't last. These people were too well-connected, too determined. Hiding was a temporary solution at best. He stopped at an access ladder, leading up to the older commercial decks. "This can get us closer to my ship," he said. "If we can make it there, we might have a shot." Lionel nodded. "Lead the way." Elias began to climb, every muscle taut with tension. As he reached the hatch at the top, he hesitated, pressing his ear to the metal. Silence. He risked opening a crack, and saw only a dark, abandoned service corridor beyond. He hauled himself up, then reached back for Lyanna. Her hand found his easily, strong and steady, and he pulled her after him. They crouched together in the shadows, catching their breath. "You sure about this?" Elias asked in a low voice. Lyanna's eyes gleamed in the dim light, fierce and unwavering. "There is no certainty left," she said. "Only the choice to keep moving." Somewhere, deep within the heart of the station, a fresh explosion rocked the ground. The air tasted of burning metal and fear. Elias met her gaze and gave a grim smile. "Then let's move." They moved through the derelict service corridors, each step a gamble against time. The walls were lined with peeling insulation and rusted bulkheads, relics from an era when the station had been new and ambitious. Now it was a forgotten artery, one that only the desperate dared to navigate. Elias led the way, every nerve in his body alert. His ship, the Rogue Meridian, docked in Bay 14, was their only hope. If they could reach it, they had a slim chance of outrunning Lyanna's pursuers, and whatever retribution the noble houses intended. Behind him, Lyanna moved like a shadow, her breathing measured, her footfalls nearly silent. Her training, whatever formality might have once had clearly involved more than courtly etiquette. She had been prepared for this life, this brutal struggle for survival, though the sadness in her eyes told Elias she had never truly embraced it. They reached a maintenance shaft leading directly to the docking bays. The hatch controls were ancient and sluggish, but Elias managed to override the security locks with a few muttered curses and a deft hand. As the hatch groaned open, Lyanna touched his arm. He turned, finding her gaze steady on his. "If you board that ship with me," she said quietly, "you become part of this war. They will not forget. They will not forgive." Elias shrugged, the ghost of a grin playing at his lips. "Story of my life." For a moment, a flicker of warmth passed between them, brief but genuine. Then the moment shattered as the sound of boots and clanking armor rang down the corridor behind them. "Move!" Elias barked. They darted to the hatch, Elias slamming it shut behind them. The service tunnel tilted downward sharply, leading them into the dim underbelly of Bay 14. Through narrow slats in the walls, Elias caught glimpses of the landing decks. Cargo haulers, merchant freighters, sleek private cruisers glittering under harsh spotlights. There, near the far end, was the Rogue Meridian. Old, patched together from half a dozen shipyards, but sturdy, reliable, a piece of home in an increasingly hostile galaxy. Lyanna slowed slightly as they approached the boarding ramp, scanning the shadows. They will have agents already watching the docks. "Yeah," Elias said grimly, "but they won't expect us to be the stupid." He palmed the remote in his pocket, and the Meridian's hatch hissed open with a welcoming sigh. No alarms, no gunfire. Yet they sprinted up the ramp and into the ship's cramped interior. Elias sealed the hatch behind them, slamming down the manual override just to be sure. The Meridian hummed under his feet, alive and eager. "Strap in," he shouted, bolting toward the cockpit. Lyanna followed without question, securing herself in the co-pilot's chair as Elias slammed into the pilot's seat and powered up the engines. The ship shuddered, rattling like a thing half awake. "Clearance protocol?" she asked, fingers already flying over the NAV systems. "Skipping it," Elias said. "Hang on." He slammed the throttle forward. The Meridian roared, her engine screaming in protest, and launched on the deck in a burst of violent acceleration. Klaxons blared across the station. Security patrols scrambled. Docking clamps tried and failed to lock onto the escaping ship. Blaster fire stitched the air behind them as they shot out of the bay, the station's defensive grid barely missing them by meters. Elias gritted his teeth, coaxing every bit of speed he could from the engines. The station shrank behind them, a blazing spire against a velvet backdrop of space. "Incoming pursuit," Lyanna warned, reading the sensors. "Of course there is," Elias muttered. 3 sleek interceptors peeled away from the station's defense array, angling toward them with predatory grace. Compact, fast, and armed to the teeth, the odds were not encouraging. Elias jinked the ship to port, weaving through the first burst of plasma fire. Lyanna worked the targeting systems, deploying Meridian's meager countermeasures. Flares, chaff, anything to throw off the interceptor's locks. "We won't outrun them," she said, calm despite the chaos. "Nope," Elias agreed. "So we outthink them." He cut engines abruptly, letting inertia carry them in a wild drift. The interceptors overshot. Scrambling to adjust, Elias reignited the thrusters, twisting the ship into a brutal corkscrew maneuver that sent them plunging toward a shadow of a nearby moon. "Shield integrity at 50%, Lionel reported. "I only need 51, Elias said through gritted teeth. The Meridian scraped the moon's upper atmosphere, the hull groaning. Dust and debris cloaked them from the scanners. Elias used the cover, diving into a canyon carved by ancient meteor impacts. The interceptors hesitated. No sensors, no clear visual, and that moment of uncertainty was all Elias needed. He punched the engines again, streaking along the canyon floor at suicidal speeds. "Remind me never to let you drive again," Lionel said, voice tight. "You volunteered for this ride," he shot back. A warning klaxon blared. One of the interceptors had risked the canyon, pursuing them with stubborn determination. Plasma bolts sizzled past, close enough to light up the cockpit with their deadly glow. "Missiles locking," Lionel shouted. "Hold on." At the last second, Elias rolled the Meridian into a narrow crevice between two massive stone outcroppings. The pursuing interceptor was not so lucky. It clipped the rocks, spiraling out of control before exploding in a blinding burst of fire and shattered metal. One down, Elias muttered. The remaining two ships were reluctant to follow. Smart. They hovered at the canyon's edge, waiting for backup or a better shot. Elias angled the Meridian toward a hidden valley, shielded from orbit. Temporary safety, but safety nonetheless. He set the ship down with a bone-jarring thud. Silence wrapped around them, broken only by the whine of cooling engines and the distant rumble of rockfalls dislodged by their passage. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Lionel turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You had no reason to do this," she said quietly. Elias scrubbed a hand over his face, exhausted but grinning. "Maybe I like lost causes." She smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that transformed her entire face. In that moment, under the ruined sky of a barren moon, it was easy to believe in impossible things. "You are a strange man, Elias," she said. "Better than being a dead one," he replied. Above them, distant flashes of light signaled more ships launching from the station. The hunt was far from over. They had bought themselves hours, maybe a day, but the full weight of the galactic elite would not rest until they were cornered. Elias powered down the engines fully, letting the ship go dark. Cloaked by the canyon, they might be invisible for a little while longer. "We'll figure out," he said. Lionel leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving the stars. "We will have to." The stars burned cold and merciless above, a reminder that escape was only the beginning. Survival would demand far more than clever piloting and desperate gambles. It would demand trust, and trust was the rarest currency in United